welcome Putney resident Carolyn Handy, who grew up at the former Vermonter Candy Factory, which is located on Lower West Hill Road in the 50s and 60s. Tonight, she will share experiences of the sweet life and give us a glimpse of her sweet world. Instead of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, her story could be called Carolyn and the Peanut Brittle Factory. Excuse me. Did you ever wonder if a family could eat all the candy they wanted? Did you ever wonder what went on in the factory when the employees left? Well, I guess tonight we find out. Carolyn Handy.
What is it like to grow up with a candy factory in your home? What are the handy family secrets to making good peanut brittle? I will share 4 of those tips later on. We moved to Putney in April 1952, and we brought the candy business with us from Dorset, Vermont. My mom got pregnant with me over in Dorset in 1950, and that's when my dad realized he better get serious about figuring out how to support the family. So he took a peanut brittle recipe and he tweaked it by adding maple syrup to it. And then along with his father, they designed the boxes, came up with the name, bought all the equipment, and they rented a room behind one of the Dorset stores to make the candy. My dad thought, well, hey, I'm renting this space and I'm renting a house for the family. That's dumb. Why don't I buy a place that is a home that also has a room where we can make the candy? And here in Putney, he found a 2-bedroom, 1-bath house that had a big room attached that used to be the laundry for the Putney school up the hill. Sold. When I was a little girl, I always wanted to help make the candy and get involved, but I was just a toddler, so to keep me out of the way, my dad would lift me way up high on this stool so I could watch everything and I'd be out of the way. I would look at the big copper kettle full of the bubbling hot candy. There was an exhaust fan with sticky steam being blasted out the window. And then, when it came time to take out the thermometer, we'd get one of these. Bet you never saw one of these before. This is what we use to lift the kettle up. These clamps would be on each side of the kettle, and then 2 people would lift the kettle and 1 person would hook this over a hook that's on a chain attached to the ceiling. And on the ceiling were something like railroad tracks. And they would pour the candy down 2 marble slabs that was oiled by oleo back then. So they would go rushing down, pour out all this candy, and then employees would put on canvas gloves that had been pre-oiled with this oleo, and they'd start stretching the candy, first the edges, because they hardened first, and then to the middle, and eventually the whole table would be covered with this beautiful peanut brittle. It all happened in that one room. The cooking, the packing, the storing, and there was no air conditioning, but there was this giant floor fan, like twice as tall as I was. Back then, there were no lips on the sides of the table, so the candy really fell off on the floor. By the end of the day, everybody was about an inch taller because there was so much candy on the bottom of their shoes. So before they went home, they would get something like this go outside and start scraping all of that candy off the bottom of their shoes so they could actually get into their car and go home without distributing candy. My favorite employee when I was a kid was Ruth Barton's mom, Millie Houghton. She was so kind and loving, not like my real mom. I always wanted her to take me home with her, but she never did. In the 50s and 60s, here are a few other employees. You might recognize their names if you've been around that long. Eva Bryant, Louisa Amadon, Cynthia Lyons Long, Kathy Amadon, and Jean Shattuck. She married Marty Collins, who used to be the Putney postmaster. They had 3 daughters, and one of them, Jennifer, worked for me for the last 15 years, and before that, at least 10 years for my dad and his second wife, Chandira. When I was a little girl, I loved being on the road with my dad delivering candy. It was a very difficult adjustment for me in the fall of 1956 when that had to stop because I had to enter first grade. When I got to be 12 years old, I got to work every summer at the candy factory. I would help my dad pour the candy. I'd help stretch it. I'd put the lids on the boxes. I'd get the cellophane and wrap the boxes and seal the ends. Then when I turned 16, I got my driver's license. My dad put me right on the road every summer so he could make more candy while I was out delivering it. And he'd just give me this crude little list and fill up a station wagon full of candy, and off I'd go. But of course, most of the stores were familiar to me. My dad never called ahead for an order, so it was just a guess. Long-distance calls cost too much back then, and everybody paid me in cash. So here I am, 16 years old, and at the end of the day, I'd have, and this is, remember, in about 1967, a huge wad of like $400 in bills. I could barely stuff it in my jeans pocket at the end of the day. My dad always trusted me. He'd taught me how to drive, after all, and we never had winter tires, and guess what? We never had car insurance. He was quite thrifty, and my mom too. They both grew up during the Depression. In fact, both my mom's parents were from Scotland, so you know she was a thrifty Scot. She was an RN, but she quit in 1950 when I was born, and she didn't go back to it until about 1965. When I left home, I wound up having a career as a nonfiction writer and an editor, but occasionally I'd get to come back on a weekday to the factory. I'd pull into the driveway and I'd first see that sticky steam going out the vent window. I'd open the door and I'd hear that loud exhaust fan whirring away, and then I could smell the peanut brittle fumes. That all said Dad to me. What are the advantages of growing up in a candy factory? Well, if you get low on groceries, there's always the candy ingredients. Corn syrup, maple syrup, salt, baking soda, peanuts, walnuts, and of course, sugar. So what can you make out of that? Well, my mom would make pancakes with maple syrup, grade B, of course. And she also would use the walnuts to make brownies. But I didn't like her recipe. She would just dump the walnuts in without chopping them, and then I'd be eating a brownie, and then there'd be this huge lump in there, and so I'd spit it out, and then my mom would yell at me. So then I learned to just take the brownies privately and eat them secretly, and I could spit the brownies out and throw them in the trash. My dad said, "Don't ever eat raw peanuts. They'll make you sick." We also never had iodized salt because my dad said then we'd have to put iodine on the box for the list of ingredients, and he didn't want to do that. So I grew up not even realizing there was such a thing as iodized salt and we needed it, and I developed a thyroid problem. Could I eat all the candy that I wanted? Well, I suppose I could have, but I was not really into candy. I'm really more of a cake and custard pudding kind of person, and now I'm on a low-carb diet, so forget all of that. Will I give you the family secret recipe that we developed over 68 years? No, but I'm giving you some tips. Number 1, don't use raw organic sugar. If it's not white sugar, that means there's still some molasses in it. You take cane or beet sugar, and to make white sugar, you wind up with all this molasses. If you try using that in peanut brittle, it's going to all taste like molasses, and it's going to burn, and so then you have burnt molasses brittle. Doesn't taste too bad. Tip number 2, don't really stir the candy very much. It's not like fudge. Fudge, you got to stand there and just stir and stir and stir and stir like forever. Not with peanut brittle. When you put your ingredients in the pan, just stir it just enough so that the sugar gets wet with the water. And then just leave your paddle or your spoon in there until you put the thermometer in. We had our paddles custom made so that the curve at the end matched the curve in the bottom of our kettle. And actually, Dickie Taylor made most of those, and Donnie Smead also made some. Tip number 3, figure out when you're going to add the peanuts. If you're going to use peanuts that are already roasted or cooked, don't add them until just the last minute. But if you're going to use raw peanuts, you could put them in maybe at the beginning or halfway through. You really need to use a candy thermometer. Something like this. Not a meat thermometer or any other kind. You really need a candy thermometer. And when the recipe says you've reached the temperature, stop right then. Don't even think about having a glass of cold water and seeing if you dump it in and it turns into a ball. No, don't do that. Do I use the same recipe that my dad did in 1950? Well, very close, except I did cut back on the salt a little bit because of people who have low sodium diets. But I felt very conflicted because I'm a kind of a health conscious person, and here I'm making stuff with all this sugar and corn syrup in it. So I developed 2 new candies. I didn't use corn syrup. I used tapioca syrup. I called this one Healthier Peanut Brittle. It was the same recipe except with a different syrup in it. And this one, we called it Corn Syrup-Free, Dairy-Free Cashew Brittle. We've never used preservatives or artificial flavorings or colorings ever in the history of the candy business. My dad died in 1996, and then in 2004, I took over the business from his widow, Jandira. I quit that career that I loved because my mom and my husband were both elderly. They couldn't drive or cook, take care of themselves. I wasn't able to keep my career and take care of them, and I didn't want the business to go out of the family. I felt really sad about ending that business because I felt like it was an end of our family heritage. But the minimum wages are really what killed us. They went up every year, and I had to keep increasing the price of the candy, and then the stores weren't able to make a profit, and neither was I. And so the last few years I was running it, I actually paid my employees out of my own pocket. And I still was delivering candy to Bennington, Rutland, Middlebury, Burlington, Stowe, St. Johnsbury, Montpelier, Woodstock, and plenty of other places. Some of the stores that I had to tell were places that I went to when I was a little girl with my dad, like Hogback Mountain Gift Shop, Maple Grove up in St. Johnsbury, and here in Putney, Harlow's Sugar House and Baskerville. We made our last batch in October 2018. Closing the books was bittersweet. Did I sell the business? No, there's no profit in it, even though my dad supported his family for decades. He never had another job. Right now, there's thousands of empty boxes in storage just waiting to be filled. Did I sell the equipment? No, it's all antique, most of it, and it's bought in 1950. I'm keeping it in the family.